Chapter 40. The Political 80s. As I review the lives of our family and friends, I have noticed that each year is similar to all of the previous ones with the exception of an occasional event taking place that defines that particular period in our lives. On Wednesday evening, January 2nd, I attended visitation at the Bram Funeral Home in Maysville for my former neighbor Esther Ketchum. She had been our neighbor when we moved to the Clarksdale farm back in 1947. On February 9, 1980, my old Marine Corps League buddy, who lived at Rhea, Missouri, Gene Donahue called us and said that they had purchased 2 new snowmobiles, and would we like to go snowmobiling with he and his wife Joanne. We of course readily accepted the invitation. Well, who wouldn't want to go for a moonlight ride with the thermometer registering -0 degrees? We were dressed in cold weather gear, and we had a most enjoyable evening. On February 26, 1980, I was elected president of the Cosby Lions Club. February 28, I attended the annual Republican Lincoln Day dinner in the courthouse basement at Savannah. On March 20, 1980, Jimmy and I broke ground and began leveling on the construction site for their new home, using our antique horse-drawn slip, pulled by our equally antique Farmall tractor. March 29, 1980, Maureen and I, and Jimmy and his wife drove into St. Joe to do some shopping at Kmart. After shopping, we ate at Rack's restaurant. At that time it was one of my favorite eating places. They featured delicious roast beef sandwiches. From there we went to visit our friends, John and Willie Schussler. During our visit John had a heart attack, and Patty got John breathing again. We called an ambulance and they took him to the hospital. My old friend was on pretty shaky ground, and I thought we were going to lose him that night, but he hung on to life by his fingertips. John recovered, and I told him that I couldn't have given him artificial respiration, because I had a mouthful of snuff tobacco, and I would have plugged up his windpipe for sure. He said that he appreciated me not strangling him with my chewing tobacco. McKinley School was built in 1907. In 1979 it was decided that it was no longer a viable structure and was razed. On April 14, 1980, I journeyed down to see where the old building had once stood. For 72 years it had been a place of education for hundreds or perhaps thousands of elementary school children. All that remained was the old gymnasium, with its interior ripped out, and it too would soon become acquainted with the old wrecking ball. The concrete steps leading up to the front entrances of the school crumbled and deteriorated. As I stood there gazing over the vacant lot, my thoughts journeyed back over the years to my first day at school, back in 1936. I can still see in my mind's eye that huge and foreboding building, and the kids running and playing at recess. Many of those kids were no longer with us. As I was leaving, I saw a lone partially covered brick. I picked it up and took it home with me as a memento of days gone by. It had been a nostalgic journey, and I left there with a feeling of loss and sadness. April 28, 1980, Jimmy quit his job at Hilliard Chemical Company. He had been displeased with the job. The chemicals that he was working with had been bothering him for some time. He had been there 2 years, and had been unhappy with the job since the first month he was there. April 29, 1980, Jimmy, Gary, Steve and I poured the concrete footing for the house. The following month, on May 20th, Steve, Jimmy, and I hung the rafters. On that same day, Jimmy and Patty celebrated their second wedding anniversary. Patty was in nurse's training, and she worked the 3 to 11 shift at the Methodist Hospital. During this part of the construction, they decided to change the plans. They fashioned the south part of the building into what I would call a chateau-style home. It allowed them much more living space. Saturday, May 24th, I had to work in the shop, but Maureen and I headed out after I closed, for Lake Perry to attend the traditional Jarrett Memorial Day camp out. On the way there, we stopped at an art show that was being held on the street in Atchison. My painting class teacher from Savannah, Velma Payne, was there, and Maureen got to meet her. We arrived at Lake Perry at 5 p.m. Bud had purchased a larger and better camping trailer, and we purchased his older trailer for $500. We were finally camping in style. We would no longer be sleeping on the ground in a tent. This is the roll call. Bob and Joyce, Bud and Willa, Yo and Shirley, and their kids. Jimmy and Patty, Steve and Gwen and Katie. Mike and Sherry, and Greg and Jason, Dennis and Rhonda Marshall, Jim, Janie, and Tanya Daring, Bud and Barbara McCaig. John and Willie Wilma Schussler were camped nearby and joined in with the Jarrett gang. Little did we realize that this would be the last campout for two of our close-knit group. In reality, it would signal the beginning of the end of the Jarrett clan campouts. Sunday was a great day and night for sailing. We were really putting the Gypsy Belle through her paces. We had a good song fest during the evening around the campfire. The camaraderie with our family and friends was one of the highlights of my life. These are the things that made live worthwhile. And as the years pass by, the memories of the days of the Jarrett and Associates campouts would become dearer to all of us. Monday morning, Memorial Day, we had a heavy rainstorm, and I stopped about 10 a.m. We got the boat loaded and ate dinner, then we all headed out for home at about 3 o'clock. I guess we didn't get our fill of camping at the lake. On June 7th, Maureen and I took off pulling our camper headed for Wallace State Park, near Cameron Mo. We met with Bud and Willa, and Steve, Gwen and Katie, and Jimmy and Patty. The following day we just laid around and talked, and left for home at 2:30 p.m. July 5, 1980, was an exceptionally hot day. A wedding took place at the Clarksdale Methodist Church. David Deshawn, son of Cliff and Beverly Deshawn, was married to Joe Baker. The church was filled to capacity, and everyone was suffocating. The Reverend E.L. Durking, who was a little on the portly side, was sweating profusely and looked as though he had just crawled out of a swimming pool. He had one CF those wrap-around starched collars like priests wear, and he sweated it down to where it looked like a wet handkerchief. Maureen played the organ, and managed to get through the ordeal even though the keys were slick with sweat. However, the wedding turned out to be the catalyst that set the wheels in motion. Not long after that event had taken place, air conditioning was installed in the church. The following evening of July 6, Maureen and I attended a band concert at the Krug Park Bowl. My cousin and boyhood friend Billy Mack was conducting the Pony Express Band. I was pretty proud of him and the accomplishments that he had made in his musical career. I still cannot help thinking back to the days when his mother would call him in to practice on his trumpet, and he would beg and cry for her to just let him play a while longer. But his dear old mother Lois would not give in to him. She baked cakes and sold them to pay for his lessons. July 13, 1980, Maureen and I attended a political rally for Governor Christopher Kit Bond, in his bid for re-election. We got to meet and shake hands with him. This event took place on a large grassy area at the home of Mel White. He lived at Evergreen Estates, on State Route DD, 2 miles north of the Andrew County line. After that we drove to the Krug Park Bowl, and seen the stage play Something Funny Happened on the way to the Forum. July 29 was an extremely hot day, the temperature was 95 and climbing. The following day it reached 107 degrees. I had the misfortune of having to drive to Columbia, Mo. to attend a firefighting school. The old Ford pickup did not have air conditioning and it was a brutal 2 days. I pulled the camper trailer behind the red Ford and spent the night in a camper park, on the north edge of Columbia. It was so hot you couldn't get your breath, and sleep was something that was hard to come by. The next morning I drove to the University of Missouri campus. We decked out in full firefighting gear, and it was like a baking oven. It was a good course and I learned a lot from it. At the conclusion of the day, we turned our high-pressure hoses on one another to cool off a bit. I arrived home Thursday evening at 8 o'clock, tired and hot and glad to be home. I had to pay my own expenses for the trip and training, but I thought it was worth it seeing as how I was the chief of the Cosby Fire Department. Friday evening of August 1, 1980, John and Wilma Schussler came out. John went fishing in the pond, and he and I visited and Wilma sat on the patio visiting with Maureen. John was 63 years of age and had diabetes and heart trouble. His energy was gone, and he could barely drag along as he walked from the pond to the patio. At noon the following Thursday, August 7, 1980, the first of our camping friends to pass away was my old buddy John Schussler. We were deeply saddened. He had been one of our best friends for about 30 years. I looked back on that first day that I met him, when General Eisenhower was giving a speech in St. Joe from the rear platform of a train during his campaign for president. John was a true friend of mine. He was the kind of man that would do about anything for you and could always be relied upon when someone was in need. Semper Fidelis, old friend. On August 26, 1980, I reached a benchmark in my life. I celebrated my 50th birthday with mixed emotions. I realized that I was no longer a kid, but I was happy to still be around. August 30, 1980, Jarrett and Associates had our annual Labor Day weekend at Lake Perry. We all missed John and his family. It would not be the same without him. Among our guests was my old friend O.C. Conley, the same fellow that I had worked with during my bridge construction days. His lady friend was Lucilla Walker, a lady we had known for years, from Helena, Missouri. During the evening we had our customary song fest and we attracted some fellows that were fishing nearby. Like us, they were hillbilly and country music lovers. They were Leigh Smith, Wayne McNeary, and Muriel Taylor and his daughter Susan, and her husband Steve Tate. Maureen said hi. Steve, remember me, I'm your cousin Maureen. Steve Tate was the son of Maureen's first cousin Lanny Tate. Lanny and his wife Mary lived at Lawrence, Kansas. Leigh Smith was originally from Bossboro, North Carolina. He sang and played guitar, and eventually hooked up with Lucilla's daughter Marilyn, and moved from Kansas to Helena, Missouri. Maureen and I were enjoying our camper trailer. It made camping much more fun and comfortable. The following day was great for sailing, the wind was perfect. Those in attendance were Maureen and I. Jimmy and Patty Gary was also there, but Margie did not make it. Bob and Joyce, Bud and Willa, Yo and Shirley, Steve, Gwen, and Katie. Mike, Sherry, Greg, and Jason. Dennis and Marshall. Jim, Janie, Tanya Daring. Bud and Barbara McCaig. We had our campfire going and a lot of singing and guitar picking, and banjo thumping, and fiddle sawing going on. And Wayne McNeary invited us all to his place for a hog roast around the campfire. Monday morning we had our traditional heavy rain, and it stopped on K at 10 a.m. We got the boat out and ate dinner, and we all said our farewells, and broke camp at 3 o'clock. We arrived home at 4:45. Prime Minister on September 15, 1980, Maureen and I took the week off for a vacation. We left at 3 p.m. for a 4-day trip. I wanted to attend an arson investigation seminar that was being conducted by the state at Trenton, Missouri. We decided to make a trip of it, and explore Highway 6, out east to the Mississippi River. We left at 3 p.m. pulling our new camper trailer. We arrived at Crowder State Park near Trenton. We spent the night there, and the following day I attended the seminar. It was being conducted by a Missouri Highway patrolman, in the Grundy County RIA building. Maureen stayed at the park and read all day. It was a very class and I learned a lot from it. He had slides of attempted arson, and the investigations that followed them. We had a heavy rain at about noon time, and it continued on through the afternoon and night. We hit the sack at about 8:30 p.m. and slept as snug as a bug in a rug. There is no better sleeping than a rainy night in a camper. No more sleeping in a tent and waking up in a wet sleeping bag, for the missus and I were running with the big dogs now. The next morning we pulled the camper into town and parked it near the RIA building, and Maureen continued with her reading while I was in class. We wrapped up our training, and received our certificates for completing the course, and were released at 2 p.m. We left Trenton behind and hit all the towns on Highway 6, and arrived at the Wakanda State Park, on the bank of the Mississippi River, near the town of La Grange, population 1,000. It was 4 p.m. We woke up to a nice day, the temperature was 84. It was about 42 miles to the locks at Keokuk, Iowa, population 11,427. At 10:30 we headed up Highway 61. While we were there we watched the locks working on the Mississippi River. I found them to be fascinating to watch. We headed west on Highway 136, and stopped for lunch at Memphis, Missouri. From there we drove 82 miles west, and arrived at the town of Princeton, population 1,047. While there we paid a visit to my former brother-in-law Nelson, England. He and his family were living near the edge of Princeton. We spent the night in our trailer at their place, and had a nice visit with our two little nieces, Angie and Jennifer, whom we had not seen for a long time. We were also glad to see Nelson. He was still the same likable fellow that he had always been when he was our brother-in-law. We left there at 8 a.m. and headed on down 136, and stopped at Bethany where we had breakfast. We arrived home at 11 a.m., and I cut some hair in the afternoon. So much for my vacation. I knew that if I stayed around home, I would have people coming in for haircuts, even though I was still on vacation. Jimmy and Patty, and Steve Oakes, and Steve Jarrett were here during the course of the afternoon. Back then as now we still have relatives and friends coming and going, and we still enjoying having them. The next day a Marine was cooking food to take to the annual Marine Corps League picnic at Tony Drennan's house. Jimmy and Patty went with us, and we all had a good time. September of 1980, I was helping Jimmy insulate their house. We hope to get their house completed soon. October 6th, Dr. Kelly found out that he had a cancer in his leg. This was not good news for us. He had been our doctor for about 30 years, and he was also a good friend to our family, as well as most of the families in the county. October 13, 1980, Mel Anderson took Bill Simpson, and Bill's cousin Melvin Mike Simpson, and myself, over to Lawrence, Kansas in his Cadillac. Mel had designed the course we were playing, and was a well-known figure over there. They had a Mel Anderson tournament there every year. I'm not sure but I believe we played 9 holes on 4 different courses that day. Mel and Bill grew up near Flag Springs, in Andrew County, Missouri, and went to school together, and played together as young boys. And Mel and I had a common bond, we were both former Marines. October 25, 1980, Bud and Willa, and her daughter Teresa and husband Dan, Jimmy and Patty, and Maureen and I, ate at the Red Lobster restaurant. Maureen's 50th, and Bud's 55th birthday, were being celebrated. October 31st, Maureen and I went down to the Central High School auditorium to see the U.S. Marine Corps Band perform. We were not disappointed, they put on a great show. Our Marine Corps League had worked hard to bring them to St. Joe, and we had been working hard selling tickets for the event. Saturday, November 1, 1980, Maureen went down to the Clarksdale Methodist Church to help cook, and when she tried to come home she couldn't, the clutch rod broke on that junky Fiat. What a dud that car was for us. It was one of those Ford cars, and I don't mean Ford. I mean 6 or repair daily. I had about figured out that the French did not like us very well, and that was their way of showing it. The man that sold it to me said that an old lady school teacher over in Elwood, Kansas had owned it, and she only drove it on weekends. If I ever got the chance to talk to him again, I would ask him where she drove it on those weekends. Perhaps it was the stock car races at Savannah? November 2, 1980, Carol Nold let us cut some wood in his timber across the fence from our North 40. Maureen and I cut 3 loads. Between Jimmy and Gar, and Maureen and I, we cut a lot of wood to supplement our LP gas bill. November 3rd, I played golf with my golfing cronies again. Anderson, Simpson, Adamson, Haynes, and I. The following day was Tuesday, November 4th, Election Day. Mooring and I watched the returns come in. When the dust settled, Ronald Reagan whopped the winner by a large margin. And Jimmy Carter became a one-term president. President Carter was a fine gentleman, but he turned out to be a weak and indecisive leader. However, one must bear in mind that I might be just a little bit prejudiced. As it turned out, America made a wise decision. President Reagan was not only a gentleman, he also became a great president. Sunday, November 30, 1980, Maureen and I went to the Class B Center in Savannah. Our old family doctor Gilbert Kelly was retiring. He had been our family doctor for all of our married life. Gib was not only our doctor, he was also our good friend. We would certainly miss him. He had cancer in his leg and it was serious. Gib used to own an airplane, and he would drop by my barber shop for a haircut, and sometimes if I wasn't real busy, I would go out to the field with him, and we would do a little flying. December 2, 1980, Lloyd Bayous suddenly passed away from a heart attack. He was 46 years old. He was the son of Dorothy Bayous, the lady we purchased our farm from. He worked for my dad at the foundry for a number of years as a crane operator. The following night we attended his visitation at the funeral home. Sunday, December 28, Maureen and I went over to Harold and Catherine Ann Walker's, and played games and ate snacks. Steve Jarrett had recently built an addition onto their house and they wanted us to see what a good job he had done. This was Catherine Ann's home place where she was born. She and Maureen were cousins, and they were also best friends. She also sang at our wedding back in 1952. Harold and I traded rides when he and I were going to GI Agriculture School at Maysville, Missouri. During the Korean War he served aboard a ship, along the coastal waters of Korea. New Year's Eve of 1980, Marine J and I drove into St. Joe for the festivities. We stopped by nephew Steve and Gwen's for a brief visit, and then on to Gar and Margie's party. From there we went around the corner to Wilma Schussler's for a brief visit. It wasn't the same without our old friend John. This was our first New Year's Eve without him. We had spent New Year's Eve with John and Wilma for a lot of years. From Schussler's we went down to Tony and Jerry Drennan's, where my old Marine Corps buddies were congregated. We had a New Year's Eve tradition. Just after midnight we would all fill up on biscuits and gravy before we headed for home. It was 1:30 a.m. when we hit the sack. 1981 got off to a bad start. On January 3rd, my brother-in-law Richard Valentine passed away in Kansas City, Missouri. He was the husband of my half-sister Dorothy, Jarrett, Valentine. On January 12th, Gary was having trouble with his bowels, similar to the problems his father had encountered down through the years. An internalist put him in the hospital to examine him. For 11 days he ran tests and determined that he had Crohn's disease E, regional enteritis, and that it would require surgery. The following day I went to visit Gar and the doctor talked to us about the operation. I told him that I wanted Dr. Ed Behaler to do the surgery. He was the one that I wanted to trust my son's life with. When he came to St. Joe, another doctor recommended my shop to him, and he and his young son had patronized me for a number of years and we had become good friends. The diagnostic doctor said that I had made a good choice. That afternoon Gar was given a pass to go home for the afternoon. He was nauseous from the medication they were giving him. That evening Jimmy and Patty, and Maureen and I went to visit him in the hospital. While I was at the hospital, I learned that my old neighbor friend from Airlawn days, Loretta Hughes, was a patient there. I went in to visit her, and she was near death and unable to communicate. My mind wandered back over the years when I had spent a lot of days at her house playing with her son Ray Louie. I was very sad when I left her room and knew that it would be the last time that I would ever see her alive. The following day, on January 23, 1981, she passed away. 2 days later Maureen and I attended her visitation at the funeral home. Gar was operated on January 28, and I told Dr. Behaler just before he went into surgery, "Please take good care of my son." He said, "I'll take good care of him, Jim." After what seemed like an awfully long time, he came to the waiting room said, "Well, he may just fine. But he will be a while coming around?" I breathed a sigh of relief. This was the first time that either one of our sons had been in a situation that could be life-threatening. His mother and I had sure been worried about him. They had removed about 1/3 of his colon. When he started coming around and I said, "Well, Gar, how are you doing?" Being still somewhat out of it, he said, "I'm hurting like a son of a bitch." His mother and I had to laugh. The last time he had said anything like that was when our house caught fire. Margie stayed the night with him, and I went down the following morning to stay with him. He was in considerable pain when I arrived. I learned that they were an hour and a half hours late with his pain medication. I told him that I would take care of it. I went to the nurse station and told them that my son's pain medication had not arrived and that he had a tube down his stomach and a catheter up his tug, and he is in considerable pain and someone had better get it done now. Finally one of them arrived and got him out of his misery, and I don't think he had trouble getting service after that. Gar was released from the hospital at noon the 4th of February. He didn't have far to travel, it was only 10 blocks to his home. After spending 24 days there he was more than ready to get out of that place. On February 10, 1981, my old friend Ralph Spencer passed away at the age of 88. If you can recall, he was the fellow that helped his son Dennis and I, back in 1949 when we farmed that 160 acres of wheat at Stanberry. He was one of the good guys that I encountered on my journey through life. On that same day, the temperature dropped down to 0 degrees and the roads drifted shut. Maureen spent the night at Wilbur and Helen Smith's house. And the following morning that junk pile of a Fiat would not start, so Wilbur took her to work. Gary was back to tuning pianos, and substitute teaching in the St. Joseph School District. He was also teaching art classes at Avenue City School. Margie was attending Missouri Western College, and teaching piano. On February 21, 1981, one of the cabin boys, Steve Oakes, celebrated his 26th birthday. That same day, a neighbor, Steve Davis, came around collecting money for road gravel. I made a contribution and once again vowed that if I ever got into a position where I could do something about the inequity of the road gravel thing, I would certainly try to find a way. On February 25, 1981, a record high temperature for that date was reached, of 76 degrees. Typical Missouri weather. March became a busy month. On Sunday, March 9, 1981, our niece Tina Jarrett, daughter of Jerry, Yo, Jarrett, and Shirley, Knapp, Jarrett, was married to Adam Ferris, in Troy, Kansas. March 3, 1981, Jimmy was hired as a unit manager, at the Missouri Methodist H.com Hospital. On March 15, of that same year, Gary Jarrett and Margie Cameron were married at their home at 220 North 17th Street in Joseph, Missouri. James E. Jarrett Jr. was Gary's best man, and Margie's sister Bonnie McFall was her matron of honor. And Margie's daughter Camille Hendren was the candle lighter. Patty Jarrett and Alan McFall took photos, and Margie's mother made the punch. Maureen made the cake, and played the piano. And I watched from the sidelines. A friend of Gary and Margie, Tom Engston, conducted the wedding. He was also a professional jazz piano player. Following the wedding, the bride and groom headed out for a short honeymoon in Kansas City. On March 20, 1981, my brother Donald Vincent Bud Jarrett married Willa Hazlitt during a trip to Texas on Padre Island. 2 days later, Bud had to take a disability retirement from Rockwell International. He was 5 years old. He began his career at the foundry in St. Joe, in 1941 and ended it in the Atchison, Kansas plant, for a total of 40 years. Oslo Weber Rondu had taken its toll on him. May 23, we had our annual Jarrett and Associates spring camp out on Paradise Point at Lake Perry. We had a pretty big turnout. Bud and Willa Dennis and Carol Buckley, Steve Gwen, and Katie Jarrett, Dennis and Rhonda Marshall, Jimmy and Patty Jarrett, Yo, Shirley, Mac, Jay, and Jill Jarrett. Tina and Adam Ferris, Cliff and Beverly Deshawn, Jim, Janie, and Tanya Daring. Lucella Walker, and Ode Conley and Son, and Leigh Smith, and Maureen and I. Bob and Joyce were not there. It was the first one of our campouts that they had missed. Joyce is scheduled for exploratory surgery Tuesday. We are all very concerned. Monday morning we awoke to the pitter-patter of raindrops on our rooftop. We headed for home at 9:02 a.m. and we stopped to see Bob and Joyce. I took part in the Marine ceremonial firing squad at 6 cemeteries. Channel 2, KQTV, was on hand with their camcorder. The firing squad and wives headed for Ronald Rome and Tracy Romsberg's house for evening chow. We arrived home at 8 o'clock. Joe and Tammy Carr and little Alexis came for a visit. Our fears were substantiated. Joyce has cancer. I think all of our family was devastated to learn this. Her prognosis does not look good. Jimmy and Gary were playing a lot of softball with all of their old buddies, and Maureen and I attended them regularly. Most of our games were played at the Cosby Field. They all enjoyed the camaraderie and didn't take winning or losing very seriously. On June 9, they had a home game at Cosby. As usual, they were always short on umpires, and usually they would find one in the audience. I was recruited into jumping bases. I had to make a close call at second base. I called the man safe. After the inning, the opposing team's center fielder walked past me and said, "Hey, I thought that runner was out at second." I replied, "I couldn't call him out, that's my son." He looked at me sort of funny and we both got a big laugh out of it. March 30th, we got some great news. Gary and Marg called to inform us that we could expect to become grandparents sometime in October. Fantastic news! On that same day, an assassin's bullet came within millimeters of killing President Ronald Reagan. They rushed him to a hospital where doctors removed the bullet from his chest. The White House Press Secretary James Brady was critically wounded by a bullet that struck him in the head. He would be terribly maimed for the rest of his life. 2 Secret Service agents were severely wounded, but all of those in the presidential party would survive. The bullets were .22 caliber. Had they had been a larger caliber, it is most likely there would have been fatalities. The shootings took place on the sidewalk as the party exited the Washington Hilton Hotel where the president had just gave a speech. The would-be assassin was a 25-year-old nutcase John Hinckley, from Evergreen, Colorado, a suburb of Denver. His father was the president of Vanderbilt Energy Corporation. On April 3, Jimmy was working at the hospital when a code blue alarm sounded. He was required to be in attendance when this took place. It turned out to be Harold Magg. He and I had attended school together at Clarksdale. He was also active in the Cosby Lions Club and fire department. They could not revive him. We attended his funeral April 5, at the EUB Church. On April 8, Marine's employer Phillips Roxanne Company was purchased by a German company, Boehringer Ingelheim. Boehringer is the family name, and Ingelheim is the city in Germany of the corporate headquarters. On the evening of July 17, 1981, a horrible tragedy occurred in downtown Kansas City, Mo. At about 7:30 p.m. the big band sound could be heard reverberating throughout the Hyatt Regency Ballroom. In an instant 2 skywalks collapsed and about 150 people came crashing down onto the 250 people on the dance floor below. Some were trapped as long as 7 hours before they could be recovered from the rubble of steel and concrete. I was acquainted with 3 of the victims who lost their lives on that fateful night. Louis Lou Ferris, 42, a captain of the St. Joseph Fire Department, was one of them. Lou had been a long-time client at our Robidoux barber shop. His companion was Cheryl Harmon Morgan, 33, the daughter of a long-time barber shop client and friend of mine, Ivan Harmon. He was one of my clientele at the Robidoux. After I moved in 1976 he came to my shop in the country. A short time after this tragedy he came to my shop. The man's heart was broken. He tried to talk about it but he just went to pieces. I could just feel his pain and my heart went out to him. Ivan was one of the nicest person that I ever met. Elizabeth D. Beth Kaliga, 58, a St. Joe girl, was one of those who lost her life. Her husband was Mike Kaliga, bartender at the Eagles Lodge in St. Joe. I had seen her on occasion at the Saturday night dances at the lodge. Mrs. Kaliga was accompanied by 2 St. Joe friends. Betty L. Miller, 55, she also lost her life. Betty Wise had accompanied her 2 friends to the dance and they were sitting together. Her life had been spared. A former St. Joe woman, Clara Elizabeth McKellen, 55, also lost her life. July 27, I drove down to the south shore of Sugar Lake to my brother Bob's place. I didn't see Bob, but my brother Bud was out fishing off the dock. He showed me a large wire container with several big fish in it. During our conversation he asked me if I still had that large lump in my upper thigh. I told him it was still there and it wasn't getting any smaller. He looked at it and said, "You had better get that looked at by a doctor." I said, "It will be all right." And he said, "No, it won't. Come on, I'm taking you over to my doctor at Atchison." He drove me over to his doctor and he examined me and advised me to see an orthopedic doctor. I went to see an orthopedic doctor in St. Joe and he measured the circumference of my thigh. It was much bigger than the other one. 5 days later Bud took me to the Leavenworth VA hospital and they sent me on to the Kansas City VA and they did an angiogram on me and sent me home. 5 days later they had me back and kept me overnight. The following day they did an arteriogram. August 12, I came home from the hospital and they told me that it was something in the muscle. August 15, 1981, my old friend Milton Lee Chambers passed away. 3 days later we attended visitation for Milt at the Bram Funeral Home in Maysville, Missouri. The following day we attended the funeral. That terrible Huntington chorea disease took his life like it did to several other members of his family. August 16, we were up at 5:30 a.m. Probate Judge Joy W. Mitchell had already caught a mess of fish in our pond. We had fresh fish for dinner. Welcome to our world, Nicholas Hines Jarrett. He arrived on October 28, 1981 at 12:30 p.m. and we went to see he and his mother Margie at the Missouri Methodist Hospital. His grandma and grandpa Jarrett were overjoyed with the birth of their first grandchild, and so was his daddy and sister Camille. The following evening Grandpa and Grandma Jarrett were back for a second visit. The following day was Sunday and Nick and his mother decided to come home. Jimmy and Patty, and Maureen and I took dinner down to their house and we all dined together. The highlight of the day was when his grandma Maureen got to hold Nicholas and watch him take his bath. November 6, 1981, Joyce Jarrett had half of her liver removed. She had colon cancer and it didn't look good, and we were all very concerned. We all loved her like a sister. We hosted Christmas at our house and we could see that she was failing fast. I saw her standing in the shadows in our office room and it was obvious that she was in pain and felt miserable. I approached her and put my arm around her and told her how much we all loved her. It was a terribly sad time for all of us and I just felt how much pain she was going through. Those at the Jarrett Christmas Eve of 1981, was our mother who was 84-year-old. Bob and Joyce Jarrett, Bobby and Janice Jarrett, and daughters Kelly, Sarah, and Julie, Christy and Frank Meyer and Brandon, Donald Bud and Willa Jarrett, Mike and Sherry, Greg and Jason. Bud's kids that couldn't be there were Steve and Gwen Jarrett. They were at Gwen's folks. And Donnie Jarrett had to work late, so he and Joyce and children Donnie Jr., and Dana, and Heather, Robin and Brian were living with their mother Luvina in Louisiana. The host Jim and Maureen Jarrett, Jimmy and Patty, Gary and Margie, and 2-month-old Nicholas. Jerry and Suzanne, Timothy, Joe, and John. Shelley and Randy, and Corey and Abraham were living in New Orleans, Louisiana. Jerry, Yo and Shirley, Mac and TC, Tina and Adam, Jay and Jill were present. Janie and Jim and Tanya were there. Angie and Jennifer were living in Princeton, Missouri, with their dad and stepmom. On December 26, Joyce went to the Kansas University Medical Center to have fluid taken from her lungs. February 6, 1982, Jimmy and Patty, Anne Marine and I headed out at 9:30 for the ski slopes of Colorado. We spent the night on the road at Strasburg, Colorado. The following day we arrived at Frisco at 10:00 a.m. and got a room for 4 at the Holiday Inn for $90 a day. We took a drive to Breckenridge for some Kentucky Fried Chicken. We brought it back and ate in our room. We had some hot chocolate and watched the skiers out of our window. Then we went swimming at the pool, and finished up in the steam room. We had 4 or 5 days of great skiing. I won the race at Breckenridge against the time clock. The kids thought they would beat me, but they were wrong. There was still a lot of zip in the old man. We had about 5 days of great skiing before we reluctantly headed out for Cosby. We arrived home at 9:30 p.m., February 12. The following week we traveled down to Joyce and Bob's. She was nearing the end of her struggle for life. She passed away February 25. She was 56 years old. Even though we knew it was inevitable, we were all devastated when it came to pass. The funeral took place February 27, 1982, at 10 a.m. at the Sawing Dyer Funeral Home in Atchison, Kansas, where she had been their organist. She was laid to rest at the Memorial Park Cemetery in St. Joseph. A multitude of her many friends and relatives attended. She will be sorely missed for the rest of our lives. She and Maureen became best friends and she would miss her a lot at the family gatherings. I was beginning to get a lot of irons in the fire. I claimed temporary insanity. After a lot of prodding by a few friends such as former County Judge Lester Salmons, and my neighbor Norman Potteroff Sr., I said after the losing effort that I made in the election of 1976, I was through with politics. I probably had my plate full, but they talked me into it. I filled for the office of East District Judge of the County Court on March 11, 1982. Besides operating my shop, my fellow barber Mel White had been appointed to the State Board of Barber Examiners 4 years ago. And at that time he had appointed me to be a deputy inspector of the Northwest area. Now at this point in time, here were some of my activities that I was involved in. Founder and president of the Cosby Lions Fire Department. Chief of the Cosby Fire Department. Deputy Inspector for the Board of Barber Examiners. Appointed by Governor Bond to Secretary-Treasurer of the State Board of Barber Examiners. On May 4, 1982, I journeyed down to the state capitol where I was presented to the Gubernatorial Appointments Committee for advice and consent of the Senate to serve on the Board of Barber Examiners for a 4-year term. August 3, 1982, I won the primary race for Judge of the County Court, by defeating the incumbent Marion Bud Gay. Now I will have to campaign hard to win the race. My opponent will be Edward Soatart. He lives in the north end of the county near the town of Bolcow. He is a young fellow, and that could help him or it could hurt him. One of the perks that we enjoyed for 4 years while serving as Secretary of the State Board of Barber Examiners were the trips. Our first trip was to San Diego and our secretary Dorothy Hartenstein went with Maureen and I on all of our trips. In the afternoon Dorothy and Maureen toured the seaport shopping, but did much more shopping than buying. Our hotel was the Embarcado. It was a tall building and the rooms had balconies where you could sit and overlook the bay. From the 8th floor the view was outstanding. We had been told that the San Diego Zoo was a good one. On our first full day Maureen and I went on a tour of the zoo. They were correct, it was superb. In the evening we ate at Anthony's Fish Grotto. It was an upscale restaurant. The kind that you stick your pinky finger out while holding your fork. The weather was great and our view fabulous. If I had the time I could sit for hours doing nothing but watching the activities taking place on the bay. On this particular day I was gazing down on the docks below. Suddenly it hit me. I was gazing at a scene that would take me back to over 30 years ago. This had to be the Broadway dock, the same one that I made that telephone call to Maureen on Valentine's Day back in 1951. What a flood of memories came racing back to me. I could see that big troop transport parked at the dock and the young Marines filling up the ramp and into the opening in the side of the ship as we boarded the GM Randall. And the memories of those kids that would be returning home in body bags. As I sat here in my study I glanced up at the 10 inches by 9 inches picture of my company at Tent Camp 2, Camp Pendleton CA. I could see the 220 men of Fox Company dressed in their battle gear awaiting our departure to the San Diego Broadway Street dock. The following day was Valentine's Day when the ship sailed out the harbor for the Orient. Looking at the picture, I see the cars parked on the lot in the background and it looks like an antique car show. On day 2, I attended meetings in the morning and Maureen and some friends went shopping at Fashion Hills Shopping Center and I'm reasonably sure that she didn't spend much. On day 3 after the meetings were over the entire crew of 104 people went on an evening cruise. We went by the huge aircraft carrier and got a close-up view of it on our way to our destination. It was either a peninsula or an island. It was an upscale supper club called Bali High. They featured Polynesian dancers that swallowed swords and ate fire. They were scantily clad and a strange bunch indeed. On day 4 we were released from our meeting and a bus load of us went on a tour to Tijuana, Mexico. The women went shopping and the men tagged along. We ate at a previously arranged super club and show. They featured guitars and singers. It was entertaining and fun. The following day was Wednesday, September 22nd. Maureen went to Seaport Village in the morning with the girls. Dorothy and I attended our final meeting of the convention. In the afternoon the three of us did a tour of the old sailing ship Star of India. I found it very interesting being an old sailboat lover. In the evening we attended the banquet and danced to wind up our convention. Dorothy had never been in an airplane in her life, and had a fear of flying and had always traveled by train. We had worked on her and had convinced her to fly back with us. The following morning on Thursday, September 23rd, we were transported to the San Diego airport. We boarded the 4-engine TWA at 11 a.m. and took off for Jarrettsburg. Dorothy sat a few rows behind us and after we were airborne we turned around and she looked a little uneasy but managed a slight smile. Things were going quite well as we winged our way across Arizona and the mountains of western Colorado. However, that didn't last long, we started to notice a bit of turbulence. And the further we went the rougher it got. There were no two ways about, we were in a nasty storm. As we approached Denver we looked back to see how Dorothy was withering the storm. She was smiling and held a piece of metal up that she had pulled off the arm of her seat. We landed and deposited some passengers, and then we took some on board. We left Denver behind as we flew back into the storm. We soon ran out of the storm and were winging our way to Kansas City Mid-Continent International. Dorothy's daughter was waiting for her, so we bid them farewell and headed home to Jarrettsburg. It had been a great trip, but it will always nice to get back home. The next night we went to Savannah to a dinner to raise money for Tim Kelly, candidate for the office of state representative. He was the son of our Dr. Gilbert Kelly. He was in the race for state representative. On November 2, 1982, I won the election for East District Judge of the County Court. I won by 64% of the vote. I was thrilled and relieved to win. I had put a great deal of effort into the race. The following day was spent driving around the county taking down my campaign signs and thanking people who had helped me win the election. On December 18, 1982, Tootle and Betty Collins invited Yo and Shirley, Cliff and Bev Deshawn, and Maureen and I down to their home in North Kansas City. They had cake and ice cream for refreshments. Tootie had recently retired and this was his card. Warren A. Collins. Supervisory Staff Assistant. Special Agent. Drug Enforcement Administration. U.S. Department of Justice. He showed us the scrapbook that he had compiled over the years of service along the Mexican border. He showed us pictures of the bullet holes in a car that he had been pursuing. This would be the last time that we would see him alive. The following year, on December 19, 1983, Warren Tootle Collins passed away. He was my neighbor back in the old day. He had told us in advance that he wanted our quartet to sing at his funeral. The song he wanted us to sing was an unusual song for a funeral. Leave it to Tootle, he would never have done it any other way. The title of the song was, My Way. So yo, Cliff, Don and I, belted it out with gusto. Tootle would have loved it. The service was at Mayor Hoffer. Warren Collins Sr. had preceded Tootle. He passed away from a heart attack March 20, 1958. Like his son, he was also a happy-go-lucky guy. Our quartet sang at his funeral. Tootie's mother Pearl Muffy Collins died. Jackie Collins died January 27, 1999. He was 59. In the 80s I sat aside part of a day to work in a couple of nursing homes. I had some interesting conversations and encounters during my visits there. One of my clients had a peculiar habit that would take place during his ride in my chair. He would be carrying on a normal conversation with me, when in mid-sentence he would say "Zero my God" and go right on without missing a beat. It didn't appear like he was in any pain at all. Then there was another elderly fellow that had an odd habit of saying "I like them Clippers." Then he would continue on with his conversation. Then there was one who would say out of the clear blue, "You darn fool." And it appeared like he was not directing it at me or himself. There was a large rangy man who never said a word all through his haircut. He looked like he could be pretty mean if he took a notion too. One day I learned about his story. As a young 16-year-old boy he became enraged at his parents. He picked up a large stone and caved both their heads in, leaving both quit dead. He was committed to a mental institution for life. In the later part of his life he was considered no longer a threat to anyone. They let him work at a country dairy that was operated by the state hospital near Avenue City. He was there for a good number of years. When that facility closed down, many of those patients were farmed out to nursing homes. I cannot recall his name, but at this point in time he would have died for many years now. I nearly forgot about the old boy that became confused. I happened to look out into the hall, and saw an old fellow standing by the water cooler. He appeared to be mimicking a dog. He would heist one leg up while clutching his member, but he was missing his target by a large margin. I went into the hall and spied an aide and told him he had better hurry. Look what Fiden is trying to do. He came on the double and got him corralled and his equipment put away. The old boy was confused to the point that he didn't know a fountain from a crapper. If I live to be his age I will probably do the big job in their fountain. On Christmas Eve Gary and Margie attended the Christmas program at the First Presbyterian Church program. We picked up little Nichalas and went to the Jarrett Christmas gathering at Janie and Jim Daring's. There were 33 Jarretts and associates. We had our traditional singing around the piano. And as usual we all had a lot of fun and enjoyed the love that we shared with one another. December 31st, at 4 o'clock I went to Savannah for the swearing-in ceremony. County Clerk Francis Turner had us take the oath of office. Betty Taylor, Circuit Clerk, Doris Franklin, County Treasurer, Ron Holliday, Prosecuting Attorney, Don Philippe, Presiding Judge, Jim Jarrett. East District Judge, Wilton Adkins, West District Judge. I returned home and we headed for St. Joe. We stopped to see Darrell Herpel and Randy Raines. They were at the Methodist Hospital. They were injured when their car was hit by a train. It happened between St. Joe and Atchison. Darrell had a broken back, and Randy was in critical condition. Darrell recovered from his injuries, but Randy was in a coma for a year. He would never be the same, his speech was affected and motor skills impaired. He was spending his life in a care facility. He had been a better-than-average athlete during his high school days. His parents Herman and Sharon lived neighbors to us and would remain our neighbors and friends for the duration. January 3, 1983, was my first day on the job. If first impressions count, I think that I will like it fine. Maureen is working at Phillips Roxanne and she has been there 11 years and going strong. January 7, 1983, our old friends and neighbors 2 miles south of us had a terrible tragedy in their family. Their son 27-year-old Terry Gorwell was driving home from bowling and he must have went to sleep. He hit a bridge abutment on Highway 36, renamed Highway 6, and was killed instantly. This was their oldest son, and this is Ray and Faye's second child to die in an accident. He was a good friend of Jimmy and Gary. They played ball on the Cosby team with Terry. He was one of the good kids. He worked hard farming with his dad and brother Timmy. He never drank or smoked in his life. The entire community will miss him a lot. And all of his friends on the Cosby Clowns will miss him behind the plate with his catcher's mask on. Some thought that he went to sleep driving because he had a bad cold and was taking medication for it. He probably didn't want to let his buddies down that he bowled with. We took food down to Ray and Faye Gorwell, and then to visitation at Mayor Hoffer's. Our son Gary was one of his pallbearers. I attended to the business of running the county on Mondays and Fridays with my colleges Don Philippe and Ed Ordnung. I also conducted state board examinations for the students graduating from Barber College, in both Kansas City and St. Louis. My colleagues E.J. Passy, Mike McCain, and Mary Potter and I made numerous trips to St. Louis and Kansas City, during our 4-year tour of duty on the state board. Maureen had been trying to get me to go to the VA hospital and get something done about my leg. February 9, 1983, I journeyed down to the Kansas City VA hospital to see about that lump in my thigh. I came home and told her well I did it. I went to the VA to see about the lump in my thigh and they made me an appointment for February 15. On February 14, 1983, our granddaughter was born at 4:30 a.m. at the Methodist Hospital in St. Joe. She was named after her great-grandmother on her mother's side, Cora Corinne. Her grandpa and grandma Jarrett named her their sweet little Valentine girl. On the 15th I traveled down to the VA hospital for my appointment. And back in St. Joe, on that same day they began running tests on Grandma Hines. On the 16th Gary brought Margie and Cora home from the hospital. February 15th, Maureen and I headed out for Kansas City where they were to run some test on my leg. My room was on 3rd floor west, and no I did not have a private single 1-bed facility. It was a very unprivate 4-bed facility. Maureen returned to St. Joe and got back to work at 10 o'clock. On February 16th, Gary brought Margie and baby Cora home from the hospital, and Grandma Jarrett came for a visit. The following day they did a CAT scan on my thigh, and that evening I had a pleasant surprise. Maureen, Gary, Jimmy and Patty down to see me. Grandma Hines was still in the hospital and things were not going well for her. Saturday I came home on a pass from the hospital. Maureen made lunch and then we went to the hospital to see her mother. Jimmy worked nights at the Missouri Methodist Hospital as a unit manager. Patty was a registered nurse working in the home health field. February 21st. I was moved to room 5 West and the next day they did a bone scan, and an arteriogram. February 23rd. Mom Hines had her surgery today and came through it without complications. We were hoping that it would not be too serious but her tumor was malignant and we feared the worst. Dad Hines was about wore down, this cancer thing was weighing heavy on him, and I could understand why. Maureen was kept busy talking on the telephone. She said that many had called inquiring about her mother and I. The following day Herman and Sharon Raines stopped by to see how we were making it. Jimmy and Patty, Gary, Margie, and Cammie, Nicholas and Cora, 2 weeks old, were out for dinner. My weekend liberty was up and Maureen took me hack to Kansas City. At this point in time nearly everyone was working except me and I was still on the payroll. Gary was driving a school bus and tuning pianos, Margie was teaching piano. Jimmy and Patty were still at their jobs at the Methodist Hospital. March 1st, Maureen came down to the hospital. They were doing a biopsy on my thigh. She went back home after the surgery. The following day I got the bad news. It was malignant, I had the big C. I called Maureen to report their findings. They start radiation treatment the following Monday over at the KU Medical Center. I was not thrilled about that, but you have to do whatever it takes to keep you going. I'm going to miss my weekend pass. I got to ride over in an ambulance laying down. Boy, you talk about plush duty, I never had it so good. They started radiation treatments the following day. They began March 15th, and ended April 20th. In all there were 36. My radiation therapist was a nice little African American girl. Her name was Rena. She set up my treatment and I laid on my back and she punched the button or whatever you do to radiate a tumor. I was issued crutches and once again I was mobile. At least for the time being. The doctor told me to stay off my leg as much as possible. Maureen and I went to St. Joe to pick up our tickets for a trip to St. Louis. Then we traveled down to DeKalb in the hills of Missouri where my brother Bud and his wife Willa had recently purchased a home there. On our way home we stopped by to see how Grandma Hines was doing, and ended up eating chili with them. The following morning Maureen and I headed for Kansas City and the Mid-Continent Airport to catch our 11:08 flight. It was a 35-minute flight, and I would take many of these flights over the next 4 years. We met Dorothy, and board members EJ, Mike, and Mary. Mike's wife Margaret came with him on this trip. We all went out for lunch, and then the board members headed out to the Barber College to conduct the practical examinations of our graduating students. Each one was required to bring a model and complete a haircut, shave-u and shampoo. We kept close observations on their work and they have a prescribed time to finish. In the evening the board members went out to eat on the Mississippi River showboat and we dined on seafood. The following day we gave the graduating students their written exams. We had lunch together and after bidding everyone adieu, we headed out for Kansas City on Frontier Airlines, and 30 minutes later we were there. On the first day of June I underwent 5 hours of surgery at the VA hospital. On June 15th, I was released from the hospital and continued to keep my leg elevated much of the time. I went up to the courthouse on a limited basis. Also on that day Grandma Hines was sent home and told to get her affairs in order. They had done all that modern medicine could do for her. On June 30th, Jimmy got a real bad surprise. The hospital where he was employed called all of the employees in for a meeting. They were downsizing their staff and about 100 employees were dismissed without any forewarning, and were told to leave the premises. The following day he drove me down to the VA for more radiation. I had to keep my leg elevated a great deal of the time, because of edema. July 12th, I traveled down to the VA and they removed about 50 metal staples from my upper thigh. On July 20th, they stopped my radiation treatments. On August 19, 1983 J.D. Stagner was diagnosed as having cancer. August 31st, J.D. went down to the KU Medical Center with me. I was there to see the radiologist and J.D. was there to get marked for radiation treatments. The doctor was pleased with my progress. J.D. was another story. Going back a few weeks he stopped by when he seen me sitting in Jimmy's front yard. He was having nosebleeds and I advised him to see a doctor. He followed my advice and discovered that he had major problems. He had cancer of the throat and brain. My doctor turned out to be an excellent surgeon and a caring doctor. My primary care doctor was Dr. Flood, a young resident doctor. He was a fine young surgeon and would be specializing in sports medicine. He looked out for my well-being like a mother hen. Many years later I would still have fond memories of both of them. Dr. Neff was the only doctor that ever gave me his home phone number. He said if you have any problems call me. The last that I heard of him he was in Omaha, Nebraska, and Dr. Flood was doing his thing putting athletes' bodies back together somewhere in America. Now that I think about it, there was another doctor that we could reach anytime night or day without even making a long-distance call. It was of course our family doctor and good friend Gilbert Kelly. It would be all downhill from here. She had nothing to look forward to but pain and misery. Grandpa Hines would be at her side comforting her the best that he could. I had several visitors after I returned home from the hospital. The first day here are the ones that came. Keith and Eunice Davis and their sons Tim and Danielle. The following day, my visitors were Ben Thace, J.D. Stagner and my brother Yo. Jimmy was driving J.D. Stagner down to the KU Med Center for radiation treatments. September 17th, Jimmy, Patty, Maureen and I headed out to Kansas City International for a trip to Orlando, Florida. Dorothy Hartenstein met us at the airport and we were held up for a while because the TWA's compass had a malfunction, and we eventually got out on Delta and flew to Dallas, and from there to Orlando, arriving at 4 o'clock. We stayed at the Dutch American Hotel, and we dined at the deli in the Disney Village Shopping Center. The following morning was Sunday, so we ate breakfast in the buffet at the Flying Dutchman. We then boarded a bus and headed for the Kennedy Space Center, where we toured all day and got to our hotel at 5 o'clock. We ate supper at the buffet and Jimmy and Patty retired to their room, and Dorothy came to our room to visit for a while. Monday morning, Dorothy and I went to the convention and they had lunch for us there. We got loose from the convention at 3 o'clock and Dorothy and I went to Epcot Center. Jimmy and Patty and Maureen were at Disney World, and then they joined us at Epcot. We left there at 8 degrees clock and had supper at the Flying Dutchman. And Dorothy and Maureen and I sat around in our room visiting for a while. The following day, Dorothy and I attended our convention and then went to a group luncheon. Jimmy, Patty, and Maureen went to Disney World and Dorothy and I went to Epcot Center, where we acquired a wheelchair for me. Maureen and the kids met us at Epcot and we enjoyed the beautiful light display. On Wednesday, Maureen shopped at Disney Village in the morning and Dorothy and I attended our meeting until noon, and Maureen shopped at Disney Village during the morning. Dorothy and Maureen and I went to Epcot and it rained and we rode the monorail back to the hotel. In the evening we attended the banquet and installation of officers, and Jimmy and Patty went to SeaWorld. Thursday, Dorothy and I attended our final meeting and closed out the convention at 10 o'clock. Jimmy and Patty were out by the pool playing miniature golf. At noon we all went back to Epcot Center and stayed until 6 o'clock. From there we went back to Disney Village and had supper on the Empress Lily Show boat. The following morning we were up at 7 o'clock and packed our gear and ate breakfast at the Flying Dutchman buffet. At 10 o'clock we took a limo to the airport and left Orlando on Delta at 12:30. We stopped at Atlanta, Georgia to change planes and left on another Delta, and arrived at Kansas City at 3:30. We arrived at Jarrett's Ranch at 5:10, and I started the furnace for the first time of the winter season. This is a ritual that they skip in Florida. Now the fun and games are over and I can get back to the business of helping to run the county government. October 2, 1983, the Bunce family reunion was held in the Lions Hall at Cosby. Maureen's uncle Marvin Bunce came back to attend it. He enjoyed seeing all of the sights of his childhood days, and enjoyed visiting with all of his relatives and friends in his old hometown. His wife Millie had passed away the previous year on June 5, 1982. His two sons Michael J. Mickey Durham Bunce and Darrell R. Derry Bunce were living in California. Mickey was Millie's son and Marvin adopted him after he and Millie were married. Mickey was a small boy when this took place. On my Christmas of 1950, when I was at Camp Pendleton, I didn't know that I nearly missed getting together with Maureen. She had planned to go out to Laramie, Wyoming to see her Uncle Mary and Aunt Millie. He was stationed there and thank goodness a big blizzard blew in and there was no way she could get there. Small actions sometimes have earth-shattering consequence. I shudder to think that I came so close to losing the love of my life. That was when I called her and got my very first date with her. What if she had left on that trip? What if we had not been granted that surprise Christmas leave? When Mary arrived, he was staying at the Hineses. When he came up for a visit with his niece and nephew-in-law, Jimmy and I entertained him by playing golf with him. We played on the elegant Jarrett Country Club 4-hole golf course. It was appropriately named Duffer's Joy. There was no manicured greens, just regular old cow pasture grass. The good part about it, there were no road apples to tiptoe around. In the evening we took Uncle Mary to the dining experience of a lifetime at the fabulous Idle Time Cafe and Beer Joint. It was located in the spectacular City of Lights in Helena, Missouri. We all dined on the best plain old eaten food one could ever experience. We are not embellishing this at all. Norman and Janie Potteroff served up some tasty chow. The following morning I was up at 4 o'clock and drove the old Master Sergeant to the train station in Kansas City. Uncle Mary had a great sense of humor and was a fun person to be around. He had fought in World War II and the Korean War. He entered the Army in 1939 and after a long and distinguished career he retired in 1961 at Salinas, California, where he and Millie made their home. A few days later I went into town and brought my mother out for the weekend. We were hosting the annual Jarrett Wiener Roast that would take place over on the North 40. Those that attended were Brother Bob and his friend Louise, and my little sis Janie and husband Jim Daring. Bud and Willa Jarrett, Jimmy, and Patty, Gary and Marg, Cora, Nick, and Cammie. Special guests were our neighbors to the west, J.D. and Eileen Stagner, and their daughter Diane. Also in attendance was the congenial Stevish, and a good time was had by everyone. Little did we know this would be J.D. Stagner's final wiener roast. He had only 49 more days to live. November 6th, Francis Coulter, a longtime auto mechanic in Cosby, passed away at the age of 55. Francis worked with the kids coaching their Cosby softball team. His son Dean played on the team with Jimmy and Gary. I gave Francis haircuts when he was at home battling prostate cancer, but he finally lost the battle. On December 4th, J.D. Stagner also lost his battle with cancer at the age of 56. J.D. was a good neighbor and friend. He and Eileen had been our neighbors for many years. It seemed like an epidemic. I had been battling cancer all during this same year. Thankfully mine was in an area that had not spread to any vital organs. I was told that my first cousin Joanne Wagenick Blondeau, the little girl that I played with years ago during our childhood days back in Erlon Edition, had cancer and was in the hospital living out the finale days of her life. Jody and I were inseparable during the early years of our lives. I went to visit her and we got to talking about the days when she and I played together. There were times when she couldn't stop laughing when I started telling stories about how she and I would become deathly sick just before our ride would come to take us to school. Mrs. Frank Witham would take her young son Ronald to McKinley School and would give us a ride if we needed one. She would honk for us, and if we didn't come out, she would drive away. Somehow we would make a miraculous recovery shortly after she left. January 19, 1984, at the age of 55, Jody passed away. During her funeral, the minister asked if anyone had any stories to tell about Joanne. I told them about our last farewell and how she laughed when we reminisced about our early years together down in Erlon. She was a dear girl, and I think that I can safely say that she was my first childhood friend. On March 1st, my old friend and political advisor Lester Salmons took his life with a gun while sitting behind his counter in his store. He had been in poor health for a while, and I guess he just could no longer cope with whatever was bothering him. He had been a good man and would be missed by his many friends and neighbors, including me. I attended his funeral at Meyerhofer Funeral Home. He was 71 years old. On the afternoon of May 9, 1984, Jimmy and I were spraying brush along the east line of our property. I went to the house for something, but I had long since forgotten what it was. While I was there, I happened to turn on my two-way police radio that I carried to keep in contact with the county. What I heard did not sound good. In fact, it was downright frightening. A Savannah school bus had been involved in an accident on Highway 169 at the Platte River Bridge at the little town of Rochester. I jumped in my car and headed that way. I took the County Road 290 west of Cosby and headed north. When I arrived at the junction of State RT E and 169 highway, cars were backed up for about a mile. I turned around and backtracked through Cosby and Helena, and onto the Rochester store where I abandoned my car. I set out on foot along the highway, and as I approached the scene of the wreck, I passed friends that were walking in the opposite direction. Several were crying, and it was then that I realized that something very had taken place when you see grown men crying. The school bus had crossed the bridge heading east and was stopped with its warning lights blinking. It was about 500 feet east of the bridge and was dropping a girl off near her home. A flatbed trailer truck delivering a large field planter was crossing the bridge and approaching the bus. As the driver of the truck approached it, he swerved over into the left lane to avoid rear-ending the bus. A protruding arm of the planter struck the left rear side of it and tore a large section out of the bus, striking children as it passed through. Those who died at the scene of the tragedy were Kimberly Boyce, 16, and her younger brother Christopher Boyce, 13. They were children of Billy and Nancy Bayous of Helena, Mo. Billy was the Helena postmaster. They were members of the Bethel Baptist Church and were the only children of Bill and Nancy. Patrick Wayne Huffman also lost his life. He was the son of Charles J. Huffman and Manita M. Huffman of Helena. Patrick was a freshman at Savannah High and was a member of the marching band. He was also a member of the First Baptist Church at Helena and was buried in the Helena Cemetery. He was also survived by 3 older brothers and a sister. Patrick was their baby brother and they all doted on him. 5 days after this horrible tragedy, 16-year-old Tammy K. Long lost her battle for life. She was also a resident of Helena. Her parents were William and Joyce Long and she had a brother Jeffrey and a sister Michelle. They were members of the Helena Baptist Church and Tammy was also a member of the Youth for Christ. Several other children were injured but none were critical. Millions of dollars in lawsuits were filed by parents of the children. The life of the young man who was driving the truck would never be the same. When I was in my office at the courthouse, I observed him standing in the hallway as he was waiting to go on trial and he looked totally devastated. Many years later, I always see the gravestones of Kim and Chris Bayous when I walk through the Bethel Cemetery and recall that terrible day back in 1984 when several families' lives were torn apart. They and the other children certainly have not been forgotten by me. June 3, 1984, my old pal Bill Allen, whom I grew up with down in Airlawn Addition, passed away at the age of 57. He had a tough life as a young boy, and it didn't get any better as he grew into manhood. He eventually did a turnabout and found the love of his life and married and settled down and became the father of a baby girl. I went to the funeral home to see the rest of the family and to see my old boxing trainer for the final count. We were neighbors across the road from the aliens throughout all of our childhood years. On August 6, 1984, Maureen's mother Edna Hines passed away at 3:15 p.m. at her home. Grandpa Hines, Mary Hines, Maureen and Jimmy were at her bedside when she died. She was taken to Mayor Hoffer Funeral Home. Maureen stayed all night with her dad. The following day Gramp Hines, Merv, and Maureen went to make the funeral arrangements. In the evening visitation there was a large crowd of friends and relatives at the funeral home. The following day we were at the Zion United Methodist Church for her funeral. All the family and friends had lunch at the church. It was a sad day for all of us. She had lived her entire life in the Cosby community. We ate supper at Grandpa Hines' house and Maureen stayed all night with Gramp. Sunday morning, September 16th, Jimmy and Patty, and Maureen and I drove down to the Kansas City Mid-Continent International Airport. We took off at 11:22 for Las Vegas, Nevada and arrived there at 1:30 p.m. We not only flew Frontier, we stayed in the Frontier Hotel. We played the slot machines and met Dorothy Hastinstein and we dined at the Stardust, then we went downtown and then taxied home at 8:30 tired and sleepy and crashed for the night. The following morning one of our board members Mike Ma Khan and Dorothy and I attended the convention meeting. Mike's wife Claudia and Maureen walked to the Circus and ate breakfast. All you could eat for $1.99. Tuesday morning it was 105 degrees outdoors. Thank goodness we were indoors at a meeting. It concluded at 1:30. I took a nap and Maureen took a tour of the Liberace Museum. And also a tour of the Ethel M. Candy Company and a tour of the Stars homes. She ate lunch at Sarah. Jimmy and Patty took a tour of the Hoover Dam. In the evening Dorothy and Maureen and I attended the Barber Board's banquet. And then to the Tom Jones show at Caesars. Jimmy and Patty ate at the Frontier. Banquet. Maureen and I, and Jimmy and Patty had breakfast at the Frontier. Then Dorothy and us checked out of the hotel and went to the airport and took Frontier at 12 o'clock. We made a stop at Denver and then on to Kansas City. We arrived home at 7 o'clock. On Sunday, October 23, 1984, we drove down to St. Joe to help celebrate our little grandson Nichols Hines Jarrett's third birthday party and dinner. Those attending were Uncle Jimmy and Aunt Patty Jarrett, Bonnie McFall and her daughter Scotty, and son Evan. Bonnie's husband Alan McFall was sick and unable to attend. And Grandpa Harold, and Grandma Imogen Cameron were there. And of course the parents of the birthday boy, Gary and Margie Jarrett. Oh! I almost forgot his little sister Cora. How could I forget that sweet little thing? I think that may have been the time that Nick got a tricycle. It was wrapped up in paper with a ribbon around it. He knew what it was when he saw it and he climbed up on it and started pedaling away, wrapping paper and all. He was grinning from ear to ear. In the afternoon of the last day of 1984, Maureen accompanied me to the courthouse in Savannah to see me take the oath of office for another 2-year term. The temperature was 19 degrees and the snow had began to fall before the evening was over. It had snowed between 6 and 10 inches, depending on where you were. We opted to forego the usual New Year celebration. I drove to Helena and contacted our grader operators to see where they were, and how they were doing busting into the snow drifts. I stopped by the idle time and things were pretty quiet there. Jimmy and Patty stayed the night at Gary and Margie's rather than fight the snow drifts. They slept till noon and then headed out for home. On January 4th, I received a letter from Governor Bond. Dear Jim, thank you for your service to the state of Missouri during my term as governor. I was very pleased that you accepted an appointment to serve during my administration. While my term as governor is coming to an end, my interest in government will continue. I hope you will keep in touch with Carolyn and me during the months ahead as we lay our plans for the future. Should you need to contact us after January 14th, please write to Post Office Box 35155, Kansas City, Missouri 64131. Carolyn, Sam and I wish you well in your endeavors in government and best wishes for a happy and prosperous new year. Sincerely, Kit Bond, Governor. The following day I was working in my office at the courthouse and Maureen was at work at Boehringer Ingelheim. Jimmy was painting the inside of his new shop building and Patty was working as a home health nurse. On the evening of January 4th, Jimmy and Patty, and Maureen and I went to the idle time where we dined on roast beef. Then we came back to their home and had ice cream and we were in a jovial mood. The following day Patty went to Martinsville to see her parents and her grandmother who was ill. She stayed 2 days and came home on Sunday. Jimmy worked on his building and had a good day and had just about completed it. In the evening Patty returned home from Martinsville and went back to St. Joe to spend the night with a friend. The following day she came home and out of a clear blue sky dropped a bombshell. She told Jimmy she wanted a divorce. Jimmy was devastated and so was Maureen and I. We were really blindsided, as well as the rest of our family members. They had been married 6 years and 8 months and we just assumed that she would be a member of our family for the rest of our lives. It was a very sad time for our son and we knew that it was going to take some time for him to get over it. But life goes on. March 15, 1985, Maureen and I went to a Republican dinner for Governor Christopher Kit Bond. It was held at the Moelah Shrine Temple on Noyes Boulevard in St. Joe. Maureen and I and Mel White and his wife dined with Governor Bond who was campaigning for the U.S. Senate. He was a down-to-earth person and very pleasant to visit with. July 25th, we attended a rally for Wendy Bailey for state treasurer. After that we all went to the home of Jim and Debbie Joesendale for a poolside party. It was in the North Country Club area. They were staunch Republicans and they held several poolside parties during that era. On September 14th, Maureen and Dorothy Hartenstein and I flew out of KCI on Eastern Airlines at 8:35 and arrived in Washington, D.C. at 12:02 Eastern Time. We went to the Washington Hilton Hotel. In the afternoon we paid visits to the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Vietnam Memorial and returned to our hotel. The following day was Sunday and Dorothy and Maureen and I took off in a taxi and stopped at a McDonald's for breakfast. After which we got on a tour mobile and visited the Arlington Cemetery and the Smithsonian Museum. We ate lunch outdoors by the Space Air Museum and returned back to the hotel at 5:30. Dorothy and I registered for the convention. Maureen had it made, she lounged around in the swimming pool, and later we retired to our rooms. All things considered it had been a pretty good day. The following day Dorothy and I attended the convention and Maureen and some of the other wives had a continental breakfast after which they took the subway to the old post office and then returned to the Hilton. In the afternoon the three of us took a walk and ate at an outdoor cafe. At 5:30 in the evening the entire convention took buses to a union hall that was throwing a dinner for us. It was a fairly tall building and we dined on the open roof that overlooked most of the Capitol buildings, and what a sight it was to see the city that controlled our entire nation. The following day was Monday and Dorothy and Maureen and I attended the executive meeting at the convention, and at 11 o'clock the entire group had a luncheon that Jack Yan put on. Whoever he was, he must have had fistful of $100 bills. Dorothy and I had to return to the convention until 2:30, then we were free for the remainder of the day. Dorothy and Maureen and I took the subway to see the old post office and the Ford Theater. This was one of the highlights of the trip for me. We stood beside the bed that Lincoln had died on, and my imagination ran wild thinking of that fateful evening when John Wilkes Booth killed President Abraham Lincoln. The three of us got a cab and just got back to the hotel just in time to catch our tour bus that took us to the Kennedy Center where we saw the musical West Side Story. The following day the convention ended at 10:30 and we all set out on a tour of the Capitol buildings. My fellow County Court Commissioner Wilton Adkins had his daughter Susan, who worked in the office of Republican Congressman Tom Coleman, to arrange a meeting for us with him. She ushered us into his office and we had a visit with him. We soon ran out of something to say and so did he, so we bid the congressman farewell. Susan was somewhat of an anomaly. I do not know whether the good congressman was aware that Susan and her family were dyed-in-the-wool lifelong Democrats. We dined with our group in the Cannon building of the House of Representatives. We then toured the Capitol, and what a thrill it was to look up into the dome of the most famous landmark on Earth. At least we Americans think so. We took a taxi back to the Hilton where our convention was having a cocktail banquet. When we returned to our room we received a phone call from Jimmy informing us that he fell from the roof of his house, striking his head in the temple area on an outside water hydrant. He said that he had already notified Gary and he was coming out to take him to the hospital. We told him that we had let her make arrangements to see if we could find a flight home. He insisted that it would not be necessary. So we hurried down to the tour bus, and fortunately for us we barely made it. We spent a pleasant but worried evening at the Kennedy Center where we saw the musical West Side Story. The following morning we attended a meeting, and afterwards our group took off for the Capitol where we met Susan. She ushered us into the congressional office of Congressman Tom Coleman. We visited for a while until we ran out of conversation and thanked him for the privilege of getting to meet our congressman. He bid us farewell and we departed. We dined in the Cannon building with our group, and Dorothy and the others went back to the hotel. Maureen and I went on a tour of the National Archives. It was a fascinating place to see. We took a cab back to the Hilton for a cocktail banquet and then called it a day. We called Jimmy and learned that Gary had spent the night with him. He was doing all right, but what he busted up some, he had 40 stitches over his right eye. Dorothy and Maureen and I went on a tour of the White House, the Marine Museum, and Georgetown. What a thrill and privilege it was for us to see all of the historical things that we had heard and read about all of our lives. It was something that we would remember the rest of our days. Friday we checked out of the hotel and took a cab to the airport. All of the cab drivers were from some other country and didn't speak English. Even the dispatcher was jabbering in whatever language it was, but he somehow got us there. We ate lunch at the airport and boarded the plane at 5:35 and arrived in Kansas City at 6:50. It didn't seem possible that my 4-year tour of duty was coming to an end. The State Board of Barber Examiners had been a great adventure for us, and one that we would always remember and cherish. On our way home we picked up Jimmy at Grandpa Hines, and headed for the ranch. Like all of our other trips down through the years, we had some wonderful times and seen a lot of things, but there is no place like home. When they were preparing for Jimmy's surgery they detected an irregular heart murmur. It would be another 10 days before the operation would took place. Visitors that came to see him were his cousins, Timmy and Tammy Arnold and Shelley Arnold. On September 27th, they operated on him, and after 4 hours of surgery everything came out good. He was a very lucky boy to be above ground. He could very well have been killed in a fall like that. October 27th, we attended the 4th birthday party for Nicholas Hines Jarrett at his parents' home at 220 North 17th Street. Those who were in attendance were his mom and dad, his little sister Corey, and his big sister Camille Hendren. His Aunt Bonnie McFall and her 2 children Evan and Scotty. His grandpa and grandma Harold and Imogene Cameron, his uncle Jimmy Jarrett and his grandma and grandpa Jarrett. On that same day the Kansas City Royals won the World Series battle of 1-70, when they defeated their cross-state rival the St. Louis Cardinals. A Marine Corps League buddy of mine, John Kelly, had a business on the Belt Highway in Greater St. Joe. His office was in the same building that the Marine Corps recruiters were, and they were just down the hall from John. They soon learned that he was a Marine and had a coffee pot brewing in his office most of the time. And he also had one of his Marine Corps League buddies in his employment. I dropped by to jaw with them when I was in their neighborhood, as well as a few other Gyrians of the League. John learned from his recruiters that a program had been authorized by the Corps to transport businessmen and leaders in government on a Marine Corps plane to the West Coast, where they would tour the San Diego Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Boot Camp, and the huge sprawling combat training command of Camp Pendleton. In a short time we rounded up 9 businessmen. And what a fine collection of community leaders we had. They were in alphabetical order: Jean Donahue, Larry Farley, Tom Johnson, Jim Jarrett Sr., Jim Jarrett Jr., John Kelly, Pete Patton, Ed Ritchie, Ron Romsberg. On the morning of November 18, 1985, a few good men got together and loaded up our gear and headed down to the big base at Richards Gebauer Air Station just to the south of Kansas City. We arrived in a torrential downpour and thunderstorm. A big jet was parked on the tarmac with large red lettering down the length of the fuselage U.S. Marine Corps. There were lots of people milling around in the terminal and the Marine pilot was conversing with the weatherman about the storm. The weatherman advised the captain that he thought he should wait out the storm. The captain told him that he had to get out to San Diego and then back to the Beaufort Marine Corps Air Station in South Carolina, and then down to Cuba and then back to Beaufort. We all moved out to the tarmac and began boarding. As we came aboard, I noticed that there were several young Marines that had already been aboard the plane. They had on short-sleeved Marine shirts and they had bulging muscles. We learned that they were weightlifters on their way to compete at a meet in California. As the plane taxied out the runway, Farley opened up a small leather luggage that contained a miniature bar. As the jet began rolling down the runway, our boys raised their glasses and drank a toast to our voyage. As we climbed up through the darkness of the storm, we were wondering if perhaps our captain's decision had been made in a bit of haste. But who were we to second-guess a captain of Marines? Suddenly there was a bolt of lightning followed by a resounding boom. And the sky lit up around us. That was when I thought we were doomed to fall from the sky and back to Mother Earth in a blaze of glory. It was about a half hour later when we roared out of the storm and into a bright sunny day. After a while the captain came on over the PA system to inform us that we would soon be landing at Phoenix, Arizona to take on some fuel. The captain and co-pilot left the plane. As soon as they returned and were airborne, he came over the intercom and informed us that the bolt of lightning had struck the nose of the aircraft. He also told us that when we land you may go up front and take a look at the brown spot. I told the boys that when it struck I may have made my own brown spot. Noof said. When we landed at the North Island Naval Air Station, some of us went around to the nose of the plane. And sure enough there was the brown spot. We took pictures of it and every now and then I dig it out and think, what if that bolt of lightning had penetrated the nose of that plane? We could all have been history and there would have been a lot of wealthy widows back home. There were buses waiting to load us up for the ride over to MCRD. We were all faunching at the bit to come home to the old Corps where we had spent so many pleasant weeks. I was probably the only one of our group that had ever returned to MCRD. Back on April 23, 1978, Maureen and I took a trip to the West Coast and returned to the place of my torment. However, it was on a Sunday and the boots were not out on the grinder, so we missed all the fun. But she got to see the infamous boot camp that she had heard so much about. When the buses entered the main gate, we were transported back in time. I could remember the day back in 1950 when I entered this gate and the memories that came flooding back to me when I was a 20-year-old kid. I'm sure that my Marine Corps League buddies felt the same way that I did. Our hotel was near the Naval Training Center, and the Navy was just across the fence from us. The first place that we visited was the entrance where every Marine boot must pass through. On the door is a sign and a Marine Corps insignia. It reads like this. Through this hatch begins the making of a Marine. To be a Marine you must believe in yourself, your fellow Marine, your God, your country, your Corps. Semper Fidelis. Another large sign had 19 regulations. Do not keep none of the following possessions. And goes on to name all 19 of them. On the bottom of the sign in large print. Marine Corps policy on drugs. Drugs will not be tolerated. The next sign you come upon says, the future of the United States Marine Corps begins here. Drill Instructor School. Back in 1950 we never dreamed that many of the generation of war babies would turn out to be drug addicts and slip down the toilet hole of a once great and noble nation. The base personnel figured out that the 9 of us were Marine buddies and had been here before in days gone by. Our group stood in the same foot racks as all Marines had done in years gone by. One of the things that we noticed were rows of 3-story buildings on the far side of the parade grounds. The old barracks that we once lived in were turned into other uses such as classrooms and drill instructor school, and offices. I just had to climb the stairs once again to see our squad bay. This was where 65 men learned to come crashing down the stairs in a mad dash to line up in formation. Across the grinder and into the boondocks is where we attended classes and sat on bleachers. We also had bayonet practice there in the hot California sun. And we also picked sandburrs out of our dungarees. When we were over at the boondocks, we observed a young lady Marine in camouflage clothes going through what looked like bayonet practice, thrusting and parrying. She was a Negro girl and a sergeant was standing nearby observing her work. We old Corps boys didn't subscribe to women playing with weapons. Combat is no place for a woman to be. There are many jobs they can do in the military, but fighting wars is not one of them. Several of our group can attest to that. We ate in the mess hall where they fed us some good old Marine lao. On one of the days we were transported in buses up the line to good old Camp Pendleton. This is where they have advanced combat training and where I spent about 6 months. There are many jobs they can do in the military, but fighting wars is not one of them. Several of our group can attest to that. We ate in the mess hall where they fed us some good old Marine chow. On one of the days we were transported in buses up the line to good old Camp Pendleton. This is where they have advanced combat training and where we spent about 6 months playing war and preparing for combat in Korea. It was great to be back and look for some of our footprints, but alias, none could be found. We were transported out to the boondocks where some Marines were doing an exhibition of camouflage and cover. Then we moved on to the Marine Corps Air Station at Pendleton. They had some Warthog attack planes parked on the tarmac. They explained to us how they were used in combat. We got to see them up close. The 2 pilots lined up with us and we had our pictures taken with them. At noon we had chow at what we once called Tent Camp 2. I don't know if they still call it that, but probably not. From there we journeyed out to the middle of the huge base where the commanding general's home and the nearby base chapel were located. It was a pretty large gathering and we all filed into the chapel to hear the general speak. It was a good speech and our crew really got a bang out of it. When it was over, our businessmen were hanging around on the sidewalk when up walks the general. The first thing out of his mouth was, "You fellas are old Marines, aren't you?" We said, "Yes, sir, but how did you know?" He said, "Whenever I said something amusing about Marines, I was watching out in the audience. And all of your group would smile and nod in agreement." During our conversation he learned that some of us were in Korea, and some in Vietnam and one in World War II. I told him about some of my experiences in Korea, and I asked him if he had ever ran into a Lieutenant Ohaneshin during his time in the Corps. He thought for a moment and said, "I think I did." He said, "I'm not sure about this, but I think he was a lieutenant colonel, and was killed in Vietnam. He and his driver was standing near their jeep, when a sniper killed both he and his driver." But added, "I'm not sure of this." I later learned that he was correct. My old platoon leader was killed. The same man that helped me when I was wounded. I was very sad to hear about him. Lieutenant Vic was a good man and an excellent platoon leader back in 1951. From the general's quarters we headed out to the beach for a demonstration of the sea-going Amtraks. It was quite a display. They turned on the smoke makers to show how they would make a landing under combat conditions. They also let us walk into the back and sat in the seats that the troops would ride in while making their landings. It was getting along into the afternoon when our bus headed down the highway to MCRD. We wanted to see some of the sights of San Diego, so we rented a van in order to do some touring around. We decided to take a run out to Point Loma. It was the lighthouse that stood on a hill at the entrance of San Diego Harbor. The same one that some of us had seen as we left the USA heading out across the Pacific. There were 5 of us that went to Point Loma. When we arrived back, we went to the dock and toured the old sailing ship the Star of India. The big day had arrived, the recruits' day for graduation. And like all of the others down through the annals of time, it was a day to be remembered for the rest of their lives. Many of the graduates' parents and friends had come from many points across the nation to watch their sons become Marines. There was the customary battalion parade, with pomp and circumstance, and there was an abundance of military brass in the reviewing stands. The word got around that there was a Wake Island survivor in our group. Tom Johnson turned out to be the highlight of the event. All of the brass in the stands wanted to shake his hand and talk to him. They had studied about the loss of Wake Island in Marine Corps history books, but were actually getting to meet a survivor. There were bronze plaques hanging on the wall of one of the buildings, and we took photos of Tom pointing at the Wake Island plaque. He had tears running down his cheeks. He couldn't believe that anyone would be interested in an old World War II vintage Marine. How wrong he was, They were fascinated to be interviewing him. After a wonderful week of nostalgic memories, we left the city of San Diego and went winging our way back to Missouri. We were flying with the same crew that brought us out. At one point son Jimmy and I went forward and the cabin door was open and we could see it and watch them fly it. The captain got up to go to the restroom and as he passed by he said, "You can step into the cabin if you would like to." We jumped at the chance. The co-pilot told Jimmy to sit in the captain's seat if he wanted to. We were looking at the conglomeration of gauges and dials. I had flown in many large airliners but had never observed out the front windshield of one. It was a thrill to see the view ahead of us. We were told over the intercom that we had a good tailwind and were traveling over 500 miles per hour. We were not long in reaching our destination. Before we knew it we were coming into Richards Gebauer. What a great trip we had. A once-in-a-lifetime thing. I got to take my son on a trip that he will never forget, and neither will I. All good things must come to an end at some point in time. We were landing at Richards Gebauer. Down through the years we will be discussing that trip and what fun we had when the 9 businessmen went on a journey into the past. I think my son learned a lot about the old core of the 1950s and 70s, and my old friend of World War II Tom Johnson. He was the old man of our group and had seen a lot of misery during his life as a prisoner of war and then as a police detective for many years on the St. Joseph PD, detective for many years on the St. Joseph PD, detective for many years on the St. Joseph PD, detective for many years on the St. Joseph PD, detective for many years on the St. Joseph PD, detective for many years on the St. Joseph PD, detective for many years on the St. Joseph PD, detective for many years on the St. Joseph PD, detective for many years on the St. Joseph PD, detective for many years on the St. Joseph PD, detective for